Shalom. This week we are reading Parashat Tetzave. It's the second of the Torah portions that deal with the concept of the tabernacle. And this week we learn all about the priestly garments. The other major theme is the inauguration, the 7 days of the inauguration of the tabernacle and really the installation of the Kohanim. And we also learn about the incense altar. So all of this is about the desert tabernacle, the Mishkan. And as we've explained many times, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is really similar to the Holy Temple. It's built for the harsh conditions of traveling through the desert. And as we've explained, the Torah's commandment that we encountered in last week's portion of Truma, Exodus 25 and verse 8, Va'asu le'mikdash, v'shachanti b'tocham, and they shall make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell among them. This was first fulfilled through the tabernacle. And indeed, even after coming into the land of Israel for 400 years, in Gilgal, in Shiloh, in Nov, and in Givon, the tabernacle accompanied the people of Israel. But there's a process of the tabernacle morphing into the permanent structure of the Holy Temple. Now, some things remain the same. Some of the details of the aspects of the tabernacle were translated perfectly into the Holy Temple, and some things changed very much, but the basic template of the structure of the sanctuary remains the same, and certainly the service itself remains the same. But one of the most often asked questions is, if we have difficulty building the Holy Temple at the moment for whatever reason, why don't we just begin by building the tabernacle first? Especially since, as we claim, we know exactly where the parts of the tabernacle were hidden and stored. So why don't we just begin with the tabernacle? And the answer to this, of course, is the fact is that there was a new reality that was introduced once the Holy Temple was established by David and Samuel, once the concept of Mount Moriah was clarified. That became the place for all time. So in effect, really, it would seem that the tabernacle itself is a sort of ancient history. Yet the Torah spends so much time and energy on these minute descriptions of the tabernacle itself. And of course, it's one thing for the priestly garments, for example, to be described, because they became the same priestly garments later in the Holy Temple. But the temple itself no longer featured the beams and the sockets and the coverings that were characteristic of the tabernacle. So in a way, it would seem to us that the time of the tabernacle has passed, since we are now in the era, the epoch of the rebuilding of the Holy Temple. And what needs to be built now, clearly, according to the structure of Torah law and Jewish tradition, when we're ready to build, we're building the temple, never again going back to the tabernacle. So what about all of these details, though? These beams, these coverings, these sockets? No, it can't be that any one of these details that the Torah is putting so much emphasis on is irrelevant. First of all, many of the laws and the governances and the statutes and the concepts of how the service in the temple is done are all outlined and derived from these very verses, and there's no change. Besides, the relationship between the tabernacle and the temple is so intrinsic, so integral, and quite simply, the more we understand the tabernacle, the basic principles of the tabernacle, and what each aspect of its construction represents, then the more and the better we are able to understand the Holy Temple itself, because they truly are one and the same. So the deepest insights into the tabernacle give us insight into the Mikdash, the Holy Temple itself. As far as understanding the relationship between the two, we are fortunate to possess a particular tradition in the name of our sages. And it's actually a parable that is recorded by our sages regarding the relationship and the proper way of understanding the relationship between the tabernacle of the desert and the Holy Temple of Jerusalem. And so the story is as follows. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the prince, who was one of the foremost sages of the people of Israel, he arranged to marry off his son and agreed that he would provide for his livelihood for 12 years so that the boy would be able to continue with his studies unhindered. At the end of this period of 12 years, the marriage was going to take place. Now, when the son was introduced to his betrothed, he was actually quite pleased. And he said, could the wedding take place in 6 years instead? But when he had occasion to see her a second time, he said, let's have the wedding now. Beautiful story, love story. And then I shall go and continue with my studies. Now the boy thought that his father, the great Rabbi Yehuda, might be annoyed with him on account of his wanting to bring forward the date of the wedding. But Rabbi Judah told him, my son, on the contrary, you have acted just as God himself did. For first we have a verse in the Torah, if you remember, it's in regard to the Song of the Sea. First, the verse tells us in Exodus 5:17, you shall bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the sanctuary, God, which your hands have established. And actually, according to Rashi, this is talking about that when the Jews will come into Eretz Israel, into the Promised Land, then they will build the temple. That the purpose of the Exodus was for Israel to come into the land to build the temple. But, continues the story, but afterwards, it suddenly states, in last week's Torah portion in Truma, and they shall make for me a sanctuary that I will dwell among them, now in the desert. In other words, Hashem originally said to the people of Israel, when you come into the land, eventually you will build a temple. But now, all of a sudden, we find that God, as it were, changed tracks and said, no, build it for me now. So, sages explain that the anecdote of Rabbi Yehuda, the prince, helps us to understand the connection between the tabernacle and the temple, because even though the main objective of the commandment of Vasuli Mikdash Vashachanti B'tocham that we find in Exodus 25:8, that they shall make for me a sanctuary and I will dwell among them, is indeed for it to be established ultimately and perpetually on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, still on account of God's love for the Jewish people, just as the anxious groom in our story was expressing a desire to hurry up and marry his chosen bride, so too the Holy One, blessed be He, sought himself to bring forward the time of intimacy with his chosen people. So actually, the parable is perfect, because the theme of the story is of a couple in love and a vision of marital bliss, which of course in any relationship there may be ups and downs, but the Creator seeks intimacy with his people. And not only with his people, but with all of creation. And that's really the purpose of the indwelling of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, the parallel between the tabernacle and creation, and later between the tabernacle and the Holy Temple. The whole concept that we are learning about in this week's Torah portion is the inauguration of the tabernacle. And we have an understanding that the inauguration, the days of the consecration of the tabernacle, began on the 23rd day of the month of Adar, and they concluded on the new moon of Nisan, on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And during this week, the week of the installation of the Kohanim and the inauguration of the tabernacle, there is an amazing tradition that Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moses, who himself was the, in many ways, the conduit of blessing before the Kohanim that were installed in their function as the priesthood, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses was the only person who could bring it all together. And so the sages teach that during that period of the 7 days of inauguration, every day Moshe single-handedly took the tabernacle apart and then put it back together again. And then culminating on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which is the day upon which the divine service actually began. It's a day of tremendous spiritual import. Our sages emphasize to us that Rosh Chodesh Nisan is a day that was actually adorned with 10 heavenly crowns. It's the day, for example, that the divine service began. It's the first day that the Kohanim wore the priestly garments. It's the day that fire actually came down from heaven. It was like the perfection of creation. So interestingly, there is an ancient tradition that our sages tell us that before God created this world, ours, the one that we're in now, he actually created and destroyed many worlds until he got to this one that he was satisfied with. And of course, there are many questions that this raises. Doesn't God know already what he wants? He has no free choice. He doesn't make mistakes. So there is obviously a tremendous teaching that is being conveyed by this idea that until he got to this one, there were others that were not satisfactory, maybe because this is the one that we agreed we would bring forth the divine presence. So this is the world that he is the most satisfied with. And this parallels the concept of the 7 days in which the tabernacle was disassembled and reassembled every day, because the concept of the building of the tabernacle is connected to the creation of the world itself, because it becomes the perfection of the world. In fact, our sages tell us that when Rosh Chodesh Nisan arrived, and when the Shekhinah descended into the world, and when Hashem saw that we actually would like him to be in our world, and that we're willing to be focused and concentrated and centered on his presence, that became like the perfection of creation. It became like the crown of everything. And in a manner of speaking, again, using our parable of this joyful couple that is marrying, these 7 days, the 7 days of the preparation of the tabernacle, which parallel themselves the 7 days of primordial pre-creation preparation, also parallel the 7 days of the rejoicing of the bride and groom. So everything that goes on in the tabernacle has this cosmic import. It is this absolute perfection. In fact, the sages call it's the perfuming of creation, because why did God create man in the first place? What was the purpose of everything? The purpose of making this beautiful world and ultimately bringing man into it, which goes back to the original question of, if man is so important, then why was he created last? Because when we go back to the Genesis narrative and we have the 6 days of creation, the very last thing to be created before Shabbat was Adam HaRishon and Chava. And one could say, God practically forgot to create man, like, oh, that's right, I have one more thing, like an afterthought. If man is so important, why wasn't he created first? But instead we should realize that God brought man into a perfected, beautiful world. He brought him into the Garden of Eden in the same manner that the proverbial bridegroom carries his bride over the threshold into their new home. So the tabernacle is our first home. Now, you know, a married couple starts off, and of course, when they first start off, they may not be that financially independent or stable. But hopefully over the years, they have more success. You know, how do you talk about it in modern terms? You have your portfolio, and, you know, I'm not very successful, so I don't know how. But, you know, they do much better, and they have that big American dream. They have their own home. Maybe they have a 2-car garage, whatever, you know. But in the beginning, they might have been renting a small basement apartment on a back street. You know, they still have this very warm spot for that place. They still have this nostalgia. And I bet when they walk by there, they hold hands and they remember, this is where it all began. This is our first home. So that's really what the tabernacle is to us in our collective memory. First of all, again, we're learning so many details that were morphed and transformed completely into the details of the Holy Temple, because the scholars point out that by comparison, the measurements of the temple in Jerusalem reflect those of the tabernacle. For example, just as the area of the tabernacle was 10 cubits by 30, the temple stood at 20 cubits by 60. In other words, the tabernacle's measurements were relatively small enough to be able to travel conveniently through the desert, but along the general lines of comparison, the two structures follow the same pattern of design. So the tabernacle and the temple is the same concept exactly, except that this was the first sign of this undying, perpetual love between God and His chosen people, which is designed to carry over to all humanity. And I'll prove it to you. Prove it to you that the tabernacle is a statement of God's love. Because here, in Parashat Tetzave, towards the end, in fact, one of the very last verses in the Parsha, in chapter 30, we read in verse 8, "When Aaron kindles the lamps in the evening, he shall bring it up in smoke, continual incense before Hashem for your generations." And in this verse, verse 8 of chapter 30, we read, "Uvahalot Aharon et hanerot bein ha'arbaim yaktirene ketoret," and the holy Arizal, he points out that these words, et hanerot bein ha'arbaim, that when Aaron lights the candles in the late afternoon, in the evening, forms an anagram, Rashi Tevot, the beginning, the first letter of each of these words, et hanerot bein ha'arbaim, in order, spells out the word ahava, love. And what is that really telling us? Because that exists on so many levels, that message of the greatest Kabbalist, the Arizal, who understood the intricacies of the relationship between God and His created universe. And there are so many levels of meaning. And he goes on to tell us, but not everyone can understand the rarefied worlds that he's describing. But on the simplest level, the menorah in the tabernacle and later in the Holy Temple, it's lit when night is falling. Night is a time of darkness. It's a time of fear, perhaps remorse. And the message of the light of the menorah that's going out into the darkness is the message of love, because it's the light of Hashem's presence that lights up the night, and that's constantly with us throughout all of our nighttime experiences. And this is the true concept of what the Holy Temple brings to us. And we point out that the commandments of lighting the menorah is described as chukat olam. It is a perpetual, everlasting commandment, because the love that's conveyed by the light coming from the menorah is a bold and clear statement of this, the love of that first home. Even later, when we get our duplex or whatever, we still have the love of the newlyweds, and that's really the main message that the tabernacle has to teach us. This is the beginning of a beautiful relationship. As we are still in the desert, we build what we can. Simple implements. We carry them, we take them apart, and we move to the next place. And the very taking apart and putting it back together in that first week, why is that such a stark reminder and parallel to creation itself? Because it is creation, because it is the fixing, it is the continuation of man's place in the universe. And Hashem left creation unfinished. It's an unfolding process, because the job that we have to do is the main thing of all, the validation of creation, the perfuming of creation, when we allow and welcome the divine presence into the world.